I tried very hard and listened to as carefully as I could, and I heard nothing at all in Ben's opening that presented any evidence for the existence of God, good or otherwise. In fact, it seemed to be a dissertation on problems with justified true belief, which I have problems with as well. So, I mean, might have been nice if we would have just agreed from the outset that, hey, I don't use justified true belief as my definition of knowledge because of various problems. Might have saved some time, but there's a bunch of objections about religious skepticism, but nothing at all about modern scientific skepticism, which I happen to also apply to religion. So showing that religious skepticism isn't sufficient, which I'm not sure that he did, is irrelevant. Religious skepticism could be complete garbage as an epistemology, and literally nothing Ben said goes anywhere close to evidence for a God. As a matter of fact, after potentially strawmanning religious skepticism or my position, which isn't what he talked about, we got in the final 2 minutes some notes on what atheists might say about Constantine enforcing belief, and none of those things are evidence for existence of God. And so when I'm talking about this, and it's a really difficult thing because people are generally, when they're talking about how do we know what we know, I'm more interested in why do we believe what we believe? Are our beliefs warranted? I don't care if they rise to the level where somebody calls them knowledge. For me, knowledge generally is a belief held to such a high degree of confidence that it would be worldview altering to find that it's wrong. But I don't care about that because we're not here to debate, do we know that a God exists or do we know that no God exists? What we're asking is there a justified evidence-based belief that a God exists? And I haven't seen it. When I take a look at what evidence we might consider, if there's good evidence, first of all, I would argue, and this is a really bad argument, I'm saying it's a bad argument at the outset, if there was good evidence for God, I would know. And I don't say that in any sort of arrogance about who I am or anything else. Yes, I've been doing this for 15 years and I've spent the bulk of my life studying it, and I've done countless debates with people and I've had people present arguments and evidence. What I'm saying is, if in fact there were good evidence for a God, we would all know that this would be Nobel Prize worthy. This would be in the news. Hell, the news reports things that they don't even have good evidence for. Certainly, if we had good evidence for something, this would be newsworthy. There would be no more debates. And yet the truth is, we live in a world where we can't get people to agree on things that are actually factual and determined and demonstrable. I mean, like facts about climate change. Do we know all of it? No, but there are some people who pretend that this isn't even happening. What about evolution? Evolution is an observable, demonstrable fact. The theory by which we would explain evolution is a scientific theory, a model. We can talk about the efficacies of vaccines, how they actually do work and how they don't cause autism. We can't even necessarily convince people that the earth isn't flat and that their experiences that they think are real with regard to ghosts and aliens probably are not, that merely their personal experience or their interpretation of events aren't necessarily justified. There are things that we know. There are things that we believe and have strong evidence for, and then there are other things. Now, good evidence can, in fact, lead to a false conclusion. For the longest time, we had good evidence that the sun orbited the Earth. We know now that that's not wrong. Did that evidence stop being good? Actually, I'd argue that what happened is that evidence that we would use to reach that conclusion was found to still be good evidence, just incomplete. We didn't have a complete model, and new information turned it on its head. And until we got better evidence, it was reasonable to conclude that the sun went around the Earth, even though it wasn't true. You can have a reasonably justified belief that's independent of whether it's true. And I'd like, since we spent the entire opening kind of trashing a version of skepticism that isn't mine and talking about problems with knowledge that isn't relevant to this, I'd really like to find out, is there good evidence for a God, for the existence of God? And if there is, what is that evidence? Because just saying, well, you can't justify knowledge is irrelevant. I don't care about knowledge. I'm not claiming about knowledge. Wouldn't even expect Ben to say he knows that there's a God. He might know. But what I would expect him to say is that he believes this and that he has good reason for it. And what is the good reason? I don't know.
Okay. Well, Matt, I agree that we're coming at this from the standpoint, more from a discussion standpoint than a collegiate debate. Sure. And so my intent, as I stated at the outset of my original opening statement, was twofold. Number one, I believe that there are not good arguments from religious skepticism to show that God doesn't exist. And number two, that I also happen to believe that there are several good arguments, and one in particular that I'll employ for this evening, to show that God does exist. And so my opening statement merely was for the purpose of setting the first point in that twofold approach.
I'm wondering if we could agree that it's not up to anybody to prove that there isn't a God, that until such time as there's a good justification, belief in a God isn't warranted. It's not like you're justified in believing in God until I prove it wrong. Nobody's justified in believing anything, including a God proposition, until they have a good argument for it and evidence.
And I'm willing to allow that to be the grounds for discussion, religious discussion and inquiry into the subject of God's existence in the context of this discussion. So I think that that's a good place for us to begin.
So how do we start? How do we begin? Like you say you have one argument. I'm sure you have many, and I'm sure you have lots of reasons, but you had one in particular. I have no idea why it wasn't presented in the opening, but I'm happy for you to present it now so that we can discuss it.
Sure. Well, I think that one of the very strong arguments for the existence of God is something that I refer to as the axiomatic argument for God's existence. This is very much like the ontological argument for God's existence, the argument for God from his being, but it asserts a slightly different point. The purpose of the axiomatic argument for God's existence is to show that God exists in every single world that we might conceive of to exist, and this would include all possible worlds that we might imagine. And as it turns out, because the concept of God, at least at the conceptual level, is entirely unerasable on strong grounds, I think, that therefore we're not in a position to airbrush a divine causal beginning to any world that we might imagine for the sake of any argument. That it's just simply not rational to do so. And so
what's the argument?
The argument essentially, I might refer to it as the ever-pending birthday. Imagine that you, Matt Dillahunty, have walked into a room only to encounter an infinite row of tumbling dominoes. Each falling tile collapses a subsequent member, causing the preceding domino to plummet towards the earth. And each successive domino takes all of 1 second to accomplish its inevitable collision with the floor. And now imagine that the row of dominoes is utterly beginningless, leading to a final domino standing near your foot. Bending down, you notice that the domino bears an inscription which reads the exact date of your birth. And so you then begin to wonder, if the set of dominoes is infinitely long, how much time will it take for my birthday domino to collapse? And of course, the answer is unavoidable. The tile would never fall. Consequently, that would imply that you could never be born. And so this means that in any world that we imagine, none of these worlds can be eternal in the past. Some initial trigger has to set the world in motion. And so this essentially means that the initial cause that brought this world that we live in into existence, any finite cause itself requires some sort of a causal parent. And so therefore, since the cause that triggered the other causes, we have to inquire into what is the founding reason for this. If the reason is something which lies outside of the cause itself, then it and not the cause is the real reason why the world exists. And so the parent cause of the world necessarily causes itself to cause the other causes to be set in motion. And this seems to imply a conscious will at work in the world of really any world that we might imagine. It seems that this would apply to the world of the Swiss Family Robinson, as well as to the world that we're having this discussion in right now. And so because that concept seems unerasable to me, it seems to me that we are stuck with God's existence as a matter of a sheer axiom. That is a self-evident, irreducible prime that we're never justified in questioning. So that really convinced me.
So you started by saying this was a version of the ontological argument, and I don't care what category we put it in, but everything about it for me reads as a first cause argument and not an ontological argument. That it has nothing to do with necessarily the characteristics of a God, but instead a fictional, one-directionally infinite timeline. So first of all, to the extent that we know and understand time and causality, it seems to be contained within the universe that we inhabit, and that universe, by the best physics and cosmology that I'm aware of, began somewhere around 13.7 billion years ago, and that time began with that. So talking about time prior to this is already nonsensical. And so if you were to talk about something that stretched infinitely into the past, granted, Carl Sagan pointed out that he had an objection when somebody said, if we don't stop at some point, stop asking what came before this, then we might never stop. And Carl Sagan famously was like, then why stop? But the thing is, this
That's
set
the
of
argument
dominant
of infinitism.
Well, the thing is that
Yes.
same infinitism exists in the Zeno's arrow paradox, which you don't have to go you don't have to start with my birthday and try and go back forever. All you have to do is say that 1 minute before I was born, there's an infinite amount of time in between that time and now that you would have to cross. And you would have to, in order to cross the first half a second, you'd have to cross the first quarter of a second, you'd have to cross the first eighth of a second, the 16th, and this goes on, that there's an infinity between these. And here's the problem, is that every time we're trying, I understand that some mathematicians will talk about different types of infinities they can use, but generally speaking, infinity is not a quantity. It is a concept for a lack of a quantity. So when you try to construct this thing and say, well, if that line of dominoes went on forever into the past, which I don't even know how that's remotely possible, because the best of science doesn't say that the past is infinite.
I would agree, it's not.
Just that we are one directionally infinite into the future from the instant of the beginning. But if what you're arguing is true, is God eternal?
Well, I think that there are several things that I would like to point out, and that is that in the case of Zeno's paradox, the length of space, the spatial extent between the one end of the stadium to the other, is actually conceptually prior to our subdivisions of it into infinite segments. And so, therefore, the point is that the line itself is finite in duration, however we might divide the actual line itself. And so, yes, of course, I would admit that it's true that you can subdivide any finite space into infinite amounts. Of course, that's true in one sense.
But it still means you can't get there. So what I'm asking is God infinite? Is God? Well,
I think that essentially,
does God have a beginning?
Yes. And here I would admit.
You think God had a beginning?
Well, I think that what I'm saying is that I would admit that if it is the case that God himself has persisted through an infinite sequence of temporal events, that God himself falls on the same sword, so to speak, as the universe does, or any world that we might imagine. But I don't think that that's the argument necessarily. I think that the way that Christians typically think of God is existing in a sort of a temporal now. If we could imagine God's thoughts being brought down into a room that you and I are standing in, what we discover is that those thoughts could not be arranged in a chronological sequence. And that's because all of God's thoughts exist to him in a present eternal now. And so God does not experience a temporal sequence of events in himself. Therefore, the problem disappears in the case of a first cause. And so I think that that's a pretty good response to the questions that you raised.
Well, I mean, the question I asked is, does God have a beginning? And you seem to say yes.
No, I'm not saying that God has a beginning.
That's what confused me, because you went on this thing after I asked it, because does God have a beginning? So the fact that Christians,
I'm not saying that. Sorry if it drew that impression.
Well, I mean, you literally said yes, but I think you were thinking about something else, which is why I wanted to clarify it. So the fact that Christians have a particular notion of God existing outside of time, as if our timeline is just a function within God, that's cool. I don't know how you'd prove it. And when you talk about God in the sense that God must exist in all possible worlds, I don't know how you prove that either, because so far I asked a couple times.
Okay.
I'm waiting for the actual, does your argument have premises and conclusion? Because I have yet to hear that, and I was want to write it down so I address your argument accurately. So what is it?
Sure. Well, I would say that the proof that this is true is the fact that it's axiomatic.
Okay. No. Axioms. You don't, the fact that something's axiomatic does not prove that it's true. An axiom is something that you assume is true as a matter of necessity, a sort of presupposition, or something you assume is true for the sake of the argument. What I asked was, does your argument, does it have a formal structure with premises and conclusion?
Well, my understanding is that essentially an axiomatic argument is part of several types of arguments that essentially issue from an argument called foundationalism. Foundationalism historically has taken on two essential forms, that of presuppositionalism and that of axiomatic arguments. Presuppositions are things that we presuppose for the purposes of testing what follows, whether or not certain things follow or not. Well, axioms are things that are self-evidently true. In other words, the evidence is in the sheer pronouncement of the proposition itself. 2 + 2 = 4. A
That's
plus B
not
is equal to B
axiomatic.
plus A. These are the axioms of mathematics.
Those aren't the
logical axioms as well.
So the answer to my question, then, I'm going to assume, is that no, your argument does not have set premises and a conclusion for me to write down.
Well, I think that I walked out a simple illustration that demonstrates the necessity of there being an axiomatic beginning to any universe that we might possibly imagine. It doesn't matter if you're the guy who's been sort of a computer has stolen your brain, disposed of all the postcranial content, and has inserted you into a tube in the matrix. That matrix world necessarily has a first cause. Every single world that we imagine has this cause, and this is therefore a matter of an axiom. It's not something that we can airbrush out of our picture of any world that we might imagine. And so it is something that is inescapably to be dealt with as A plus B is equal to B plus A, or that you and I equal 2, whether we're standing in heaven, earth, or in hell. It doesn't matter. You and I equal 2. So and asking for proof to something like that, it seems like a strange request. It seems to
it doesn't seem a strange request at all.
There's
nothing strange about the request at all. So mathematics is directly derived from the foundations of logic, and it's not 2 + 2 = 4 is not an axiom. 2 + 2 = 4 is based on axiomatic foundations of mathematics.
Yes, it is.
And notions of regularity. But those are things that are still regarded as true, but not demonstrated as true. If we could demonstrate they were true, they wouldn't be called axioms. Now, the axioms that are around that result in 2 + 2 = 4, those the conclusions from those are things that we can demonstrate to consistently be reliably true. Neither one of us are going to say, 1 + 1 = 73. We're probably not going to say that unless we have some really peculiar root-based system of math with different operands. But if we're talking about normative, we're talking about quantities, then that's where we're at. However, to say why does 1 + 1 = 2 is something that we can actually work towards and demonstrate. Just like,
and I would agree with that.
The fact that identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle are presuppositions which we cannot demonstrate, but which we assume are true and appear to be uniformly absolutely true in the sense that they appear to be inviolate, that you would have to assume they were true to try to prove they weren't true. And I don't know what you would have to assume in order to try to prove them false, but you'd have to come up with some way of justifying that. It's not just.
And that's precisely my point. That's what this argument is like for God's existence. Is that
except that's not an argument for God's existence. The fact that we assume something to be true is not an argument that it is true, and it's certainly not evidence that it is true. In fact, the things
now it's
that
not
we
an argument in the sense.
Hang on.
Okay.
The fact that we assume something as a necessity is because we do not have good evidence for it. If we have good evidence for it, we don't need to assume it. We just demonstrate it. So if your entire case is that God is axiomatic, then you're acknowledging there is no good evidence for God, or at least there's no good evidence going to be presented for God, because if there's good evidence, we don't need to assume.
If you're going to go that direction, coherentism seems to collapse to a form of foundationalism. So the scientist is essentially saying, well, I foundationally believe that all of my empirical deliverances are true, but isn't that just a form of foundationalism? So then what's wrong with the Christian's evidence? So if those are the only 3 live options we have in terms of what types of evidence we can choose from, well, certainly I would say that sexist empiricist arguments are so persuasive that most modern philosophers have essentially said that they're almost irresistible.
Except that,
to me, I find that to be true.
Well, so this is an interesting topic that I've had lots of conversations with, except it has nothing to do with whether or not there's good evidence for God. And instead of just relying on sextus, I've actually looked into things a little bit further and more modern. I don't know if you're familiar with Susan Haack, who's come up with a thing that she calls foundherentism, which is an epistemology that combines principles of foundationalism with coherentism. I don't know what the defeater is. I don't know what the defeater is for that. It seems to be the most consistent or the view that is most consistent with the way that I go about things. However, at the end of the day, I'm a scientific skeptic. And what I want is evidence. I don't want somebody to tell me God is axiomatic, because clearly, like if I were to tell you no God, the notion that God exists is axiomatic, you would reject that. And so there must be some reason for opting for God is axiomatic. But the second you do that, you're saying there isn't good evidence for God, or I'm not aware of good evidence for God, because if there is evidence for it, you don't take it as an axiom. There's evidence for DNA testing. I don't have to take it as axiomatic that DNA testing works. It is evidence-based. And if in fact there is a God, does God, I'll have questions about God. Does the God that you're advocating, can that God act within the material world in a way that is detectable?
I think so. I don't see why not. He's God.
I don't see why not either. But if God is detectable, then you don't need an axiom. What you need is evidence. So
yes,
what is something that God can do that we can empirically verify?
Yeah, I would say that miracles would be an example of this. But getting back to the argument for God's existence, I think that you can easily force any sign, wonder, or miracle that you see into an infinite regress of proofs. No reason not to. You've got that option, or you can just simply try to argue from some other presupposed basis of coherentism.
It'd be really great if you didn't spend nearly so much time trying to anticipate what my objection is going to be and just have the discussion. Okay, your entire opening was an anticipation of what you thought a religious skeptic was going to say. It literally had nothing to do with my position or this debate at all. And now I'm asking, can God do something in reality that is detectable? And you say, yes, miracles. But before I can even start to talk about this, you're immediately anticipating what objections are going to be. Please identify some miracle that we can reasonably attribute to a God.
Well, you're asking for a miracle that you and I can reasonably attribute to God. I'm assuming that you want a miracle that happens right in front of us.
I'd love for you to give any example of any miracle, because I hear lots of claims about miracles. I have yet to hear about any miracle that has actually been verified.
And has actually been verified.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the arguments for the resurrection of Jesus are fairly stable.
The resurrection of Jesus hasn't been verified.
That depends on what you are demanding as a reasonable grounds for verification. And I think that essentially the problem that I see is that in many cases, and I don't know if this is the case with you, so I won't suppose on the front end that this is the way that you see things, but many atheists and skeptics seem to suggest that that all these arguments from history, historical arguments, are based on induction.
I promise.
Not deduction.
I'm trying to be as patient as I can. Please stop debating other atheists that aren't here and have the conversation with the one that's here. I'm not here to defend what other atheists believe. All I've asked is provide evidence for a miracle, and you are now talking about what other atheists believe. How is that relevant to you providing evidence for a miracle?
Sure. Well, I think that the evidence for the miracle of the resurrection is fairly strong because it's been historically substantiated, and that's good enough, it seems. Otherwise, it seems to me...
Now, I want to make sure we're clear, because there's a soundbite right there where I asked you for a miracle, and your statement is the evidence for the resurrection is historical, and that's good enough for you. You didn't provide any evidence. You just, once again, told me what you're convinced of. How can I, and I swear I'm not trying to be obtuse. I am here as a lost soul, according to your notion. According to your religious view, which I don't really know particularly well, I'm going to guess that I am desperately in need of the truth about Jesus, or my soul is damned to elimination or hell. I don't know if you believe in a literal hell or what. And yet, when I ask you to provide evidence for a miracle, your answer is the resurrection is historically confirmed enough to suit you.
Yes, I think it's. Okay. I think it should.
Then I don't know what we have to talk about, because you're not presenting any evidence in your opening. You're not presenting any evidence in this discussion. You're just once again restating that you are in fact convinced of something.
I haven't gotten around to
How
saying
much-
particularly what the evidence is, I can.
We've been debating for almost
Certainly.
an hour. The whole purpose of the debate was to present evidence for God. How could you possibly say I haven't gotten around to it yet? Because that seems ridiculous.
No, I do believe that I've gotten around to the notion that I think we have a good reason to suppose on the basis of an axiomatic demonstration that God exists. That's the topic for tonight's discussion, and that's what I've come ready to speak into.
But you haven't presented any evidence, and you're wanting to accept it axiomatically, which means that now we're not even having a debate.
Well, I would say that the other two options that we have in the trilemma I just mentioned are unfavorable, and I think that perhaps you would say that that's true as well.
The trilemma you just talked about, infinitism, coherentism, and foundationism, are about epistemology. They are not about a God.
Sure,
you've barely spoken.
Evidence.
You have barely spoken about a God. And now when I say, where's the evidence? You say, well, there's only those three possibilities. Well, first of all, I already acknowledged that maybe there aren't. I don't care if you see any others. I just pointed you to Susan Hawk's foundationism. But in the end of the day, no matter which epistemological model you use, there's either evidence for a God or there's not. And there's either good evidence for a God or there's not. Are you ever planning to present good evidence for a God, which was the purpose of this debate?
I think that essentially what I've come into this discussion to do is to simply show that there are good reasons to believe that God exists, and that I think that axiomatic demonstrations are the strongest form of
then I have nothing more to say, because
could have.
If we didn't agree on a debate of, hey, can I come up with a good reason to believe in a God? And the only thing that I have to do is say that I'm convinced it's good. The issue here under debate was, is there good evidence for God? If we're not going to talk about evidence,
that does depend on the type of evidence that you're willing to accept.
It doesn't matter what evidence depends on. You have to actually present it. If you're not going to present evidence for the existence of God, then we should have had a debate about epistemology, which I'm happy to do. I just did a couple of weeks ago. But if I would agree to do a debate on epistemology, then we could discuss that. But if you're going to say, I'm going to come in and debate Matt Dillahunty on whether or not there's good evidence for God, and I'm not going to present any evidence, good or otherwise, and I'm just going to say that it's axiomatic, and that I don't see anything newer or more reliable than what a second century Greek thought about epistemology. I don't know what to say. There's nothing more to do. My job here is to point out why I either accept or reject your evidence. But if you're not going to present evidence, then we're wasting time and might as well just go to questions.
This might be an interesting question to ask: is what is the reason to suppose that an axiomatic demonstration is somehow a faulty reason or suspect reason to believe in the existence of God?
Because it needs to be supported by evidence. You can't, so you could take, there's no God belief that one could propose that one couldn't accept axiomatically. I could axiomatically accept Allah, Yahweh, whatever model Scientology is. It doesn't even have to be a God. I could axiomatically accept any one of those. I'm concerned with whether or not there's evidence and whether or not there's good evidence. And I was told that I was coming to a debate about whether or not there's good evidence. And now you're not presenting any good or otherwise and saying that it's unnecessary because it being axiomatic is enough. Now, if something's axiomatic,
seems that that's true.
If something's axiomatic, there's no debate.
Well, I think that you would be in a position to say whether or not you agree that type of demonstration is good enough to persuade you, Matt Dillahunty, for the existence of a God, that since it seems that we don't have a good grounds for launching an argument which says that this isn't true, and I don't think that I've heard one, then I would say
you already agreed. You don't get to do this. You don't get to say you haven't heard an argument against God when we already established at the outset and you agreed that the burden of proof is on you. It's not up to me to prove there is no God.
I think that it's best to say that in any discussion, one way or the other, I do not view the standpoint of atheism as being something that is somehow epistemically neutral.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm defending my position. The debate here is that you either have good evidence for the existence of God, which I then either acknowledge is good evidence, or I say it's not good evidence and here's why. but I'm not in any position where I'm required to prove that a God doesn't exist. In both in real life, with the fact of me being an atheist and putting the burden of proof where it's supposed to be, based on proper epistemology. However, in this debate, the debate is there good evidence? Now, I'm going to ask this just one last time, and then maybe we'll just go on to questions from the audience. Are you going to present actual evidence for a God?
Either way. I think that I have shown that there are three possibilities, three major possibilities, and I already did mention the combination of coherentism and foundationalism in my explanation. And I think I said that there are these three possibilities that we might entertain on how to establish evidence of any kind or some sort of a demonstration of any kind. I think this is a fairly good one. It seems to me that it's fairly strong. I haven't heard any good arguments against it. And so I think that because it seems to stand up the way that it does to questioning, that it's a fairly sturdy grounds for believing that God exists.
Okay.
Yeah.
Congrats. But you've presented no evidence.
Maybe.
And if the debate is about good evidence, you don't just get to say it's axiomatic. That's not what evidence is.
I think that this is one form of evidence that we have to choose from. We have to choose from one of the three. And we don't have any other options.
So you keep doing this. You're so obsessed. You are so obsessed. You are so obsessed over these three categories of epistemology, despite the fact that they may or may not be exhaustive, that it doesn't matter which one of those is true.
Is enough to see.
Wow. It doesn't matter which one of those is true, or even if there's another option or not. Whatever epistemology.
I don't think that doesn't seem like there is.
Am I going to be able to finish?
I apologize. Please do finish.
I let you talk for a long time, and I got nothing. No evidence, just, hey, there's only three ways to look at knowledge. And it can't be this, and it can't be this, therefore God is axiomatic. Well, first of all, that's not an argument. You've presented no argument with no structure. And in a debate about whether or not there's good evidence, you presented no evidence and just asserted it's axiomatic. So, I mean, I don't look at debates as win-lose, but this is a lose for you under all the criteria of the debate. Because I came in to debate, is there good evidence for God? And you came in to say, there isn't, but it's axiomatic. Okay. Congrats.
I think that this is a good and persuasive argument, and I think, as I said at the beginning, as you agreed in your presentation, that we weren't having some sort of a formal debate. We were just two people that were talking about things that we believed, and that's essentially what I'm presenting here. I don't.
Yeah, but the topic wasn't. Sorry, I interrupted. I apologize.
Oh no, you can go ahead and speak. I'm willing to.
The debate wasn't, is there a persuasive argument for God? If somebody had contacted me and said, Matt, we'd like you as an atheist to come in and argue that there are no persuasive arguments for God, I would have said, no, that's stupid. Of course there are persuasive arguments for God. There are persuasive arguments for anything. There's a persuasive argument for the flat earth, but we know that's not true. There's a persuasive argument for countless things. I care about what's truth. And truth is based, when we have demonstrable, identifiable truth, it is rooted in evidence supporting it. Not, is there a persuasive argument? I can make persuasive arguments for almost anything, especially if I find exactly the right audience. But if there's good evidence, that's a different story.
Perhaps our discussion could be helped by your saying what counts as good evidence. I
talked about this. What do you mean? I addressed this a little bit in my opening remark about what sort of evidence should be good, and that should explain the available facts entirely, and that there shouldn't be exceptions for it, and that it should not lead to multiple different conclusions that are similarly or equally justified, but that I can't tell you, here is the standard for good evidence for any individual claim until we've assessed the nature of that claim. And then my job is, someone presents evidence and I tell them either here's why that is good evidence, or here's why I don't consider that good evidence. But if my interlocutor is not going to present any evidence, then I have nothing to work with. Of the two of us, I'm the only one that actually talked about some criteria for good evidence.
I hate to.
Yes. So then forward. I take it that you're saying. Oh, yes, please, our moderator. Okay.
This might be a good chance to move into the Q&A. Otherwise, if we have I'm open to it if you guys want to have like one last back and forth in the sense of like maybe a minute or two each just to conclude. Do you have a strong opinion either way?
I'm good. If there's questions, I'm good for moving on to it. I think honestly, and this is no offense to Ben, I don't bear Ben any ill will, but I think we're going to sit here and keep repeating ourselves over and over again because Ben's not in a position tonight to come forward with specifically good evidence in a way that could be evaluated. And I'm not ready to, this late in the game, talked about have an epistemology debate.
If the evidence is such that it could be, forced into an infinite regress of questions, then I would say that that's bad evidence. This demonstration that I've given is not like this. If it is something that merely is just self-coherent with itself, but pays no attention to iterating questions, then that just seems to be coherentism, and that isn't very persuasive evidence either. So it seems
coherentism isn't evidence; it's an epistemology. It's like you don't know what evidence is. You say coherentism isn't.
Epistemology is our philosophy of knowledge, and certainly it deals with chains of evidence.
It processes evidence. It's not the evidence. Mm-hmm. And you just referred to coherentism, saying it's not good evidence or it's not evidence.
Yes, if something is of the variety of coherentism, then I don't think that that's very good evidence.
I don't think it's evidence at all. But
the argument under discussion, if it somehow is playing well as a coherentist argument, if that's what it looks like, then it doesn't matter how persuasive the evidence empirically seems. It's just it's going to lead to more questions. And to me, that the strongest possible evidence that we could have would be axiomatic evidence. Now, on the basis of an axiom, suppose that P is an axiom, and then we build P directly implies Q. Q is not an axiom, but it's rooted. It's the anchoring proposition, so to speak, is an axiom. That's a good argument. I would say that's a good argument. But I don't know that short of something like that, we could say that the evidence for the existence of God would be good evidence. And so that's my point. I simply mentioned these various competing epistemologies to simply show that the best type of evidence, the strongest type, what we could call good evidence, would necessarily have as its anchoring proposition something that is axiomatic. I think that that would be important to our discussion. I think that it is relevant. Now, that's my opinion, and I'm certainly willing to discuss it, and I know that we can talk about it. I'm willing to entertain a couple more questions, but if Matt feels frustrated by all of this, I guess I have been accused at times of asking too many questions.
Well, it'd be nice if you presented slightly more answers. I mean, if we're going to have a debate about whether or not there's good evidence, to simply show up and say that it's self-evident that God exists, that's not good evidence. And for you to claim that something that's self-evident is the best evidence, because it's not self-evident that a God exists. And by the way, you've presented no argument. You've presented no argument that God is in fact self-evident. All you've done is assert that God is self-evident. And
I don't think so. I've shown on the basis of the impossibility of an infinite regress.
You haven't demonstrated that, though. You haven't demonstrated the possibility of an infinite regress. You didn't even really dig in on it. You didn't show that a God is necessary to get out of it. And we talked about time beginning with the origin of the universe, and all you want to do is then special pleading say, but there's a God.
In that case.
Whatever. Let's go on to questions, I guess.
We can jump into questions. Want to say thanks for your questions, folks. We will try to get through every one that we can. Forgive us if we don't get through every single one, but we're going to try to move fast. Marcos Makoyevi, let me know if I've mispronounced it, friend. Thanks so much for your super sticker. And then Clyde Sesites, thank you for your question, said, Matt, if abiogenesis was ever proven impossible to you, could you see this as proof of a creator God behind the creation of the first biological life?
So I don't know how you would prove that abiogenesis is impossible. And it would need to be that the nature of that disproof or showing that abiogenesis is impossible necessarily leaves only a God as an option, because the fact that you were somehow able to demonstrate that life can't arise from non-life, that doesn't mean that you can show that life arose from non-life by means of magic. it has to be something else. All of these things that want to appeal to God as if it's the only explanation left is just a failure of human imagination and creativity. It is, I can't think of anything better than a God did it. And science hasn't been able to show us anything better than God did it. As a matter of fact, it doesn't look like this is possible. And since it apparently happened, it must be God. That is actually a fallacious argument. So no, I'm not going to be convinced as God. What will convince me of a God is actual positive evidence for the proposition. It's like if we found out tomorrow that evolution was completely fiction, that doesn't mean that God created life or its diversity. That is a separate proposition that needs evidence for it. I would agree that if we showed that abiogenesis is impossible, that it might make it seem like that there's a God that's more likely. The problem is that to assume that you've demonstrated you have eliminated all possibilities for something like this, something like abiogenesis, would almost require you to be omniscient. That's not the way knowledge and understanding works. So, you know what? These fictional scenarios, these hypothetical things of, like, oh, if we lopped off somebody's head and they put their head back on and came walking in, would you say that God resurrected them? Or if something wrote, I am the Lord thy God in the moon so that everybody could see it, or if we could prove that abiogenesis can't happen, call me when something like that happens, because I'm not convinced that it's possible to demonstrate that abiogenesis is impossible.